Right now, as you listen to this, you are very likely wearing a derivative of crude oil.
Yeah, almost certainly.
I mean, think about the shirt on your back or, the stretch in your jeans,
Right.
or even that fleece jacket hanging by your door.
Right.
It literally started out as this thick, ancient sludge pumped from the earth. And then it was refined in some massive chemical plant, melted down into, like, a vat of artificial lava.
Which is a crazy visual.
It is. And then it's literally spun into the threads resting against your skin right now. You probably don't think of your closet as the absolute end of a fossil fuel pipeline, but today we're going to show you exactly why it is.
Yeah, it really forces a complete recalibration of how we view the physical objects around us. I mean, we assume we're surrounded by textiles, right? By fabric, by clothing.
Naturally.
But molecularly, we are basically walking around draped in engineered plastics.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are tearing down the walls of the modern wardrobe to really examine the invisible architecture of our clothes, and by extension, the invisible architecture of the global economy.
Because the two are completely linked.
Exactly. We are talking about synthetic fibers today, and to guide us through this, we are looking at an incredibly dense, multi-layered set of analytical notes. They're just titled syntheticfibers.pdf.
Yeah, authored by a persona named Tommy.
Right, Tommy. And these notes take a really radically holistic approach to the topic.
What makes this source material so compelling to me is that it totally refuses to view synthetics just as, a category of material science. It treats them as an epoch-defining technology.
A total game changer.
Completely. The notes cross-examine these fibers through historical timelines, environmental realities, massive shifts in global labor, and even pop culture. It actually uses this philosophical world-building framework to categorize how humanity interacts with the physical world.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to help you decode this massive paradigm shift. We really want to map out how humanity pivoted from harvesting our textiles, from nature-like relying on the sun and the soil, to engineering them from fossil fuels and sterile labs.
The shift into what Tommy calls controlled chaos.
Yes. We're going to explore how that chaos unlocked unbelievable human potential, but also trapped us in this cycle of overconsumption and permanent ecological consequence.
Which is a heavy trade-off.
It is. So to start, I think we have to look backward. Where does the timeline of synthetics actually begin? Because it definitely wasn't a sudden overnight revolution, right?
Yeah, it really wasn't. It was more of a slow creep of chemical curiosity that eventually just hit critical mass. If you think about the history of human civilization, for thousands and thousands of years, making textiles was strictly an agricultural craft.
You had to grow it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was entirely bound by biological limits.
Yeah.
If you wanted a garment, you needed arable land to grow cotton or flax, or you needed vast pastures for sheep or mulberry trees for silkworms.
So you were completely at the mercy of the climate. Droughts, floods, disease.
Right, and just the raw speed of biological growth, you couldn't rush a sheep growing wool.
So you were just tethered to the rhythm of the planet. Like if there was a bad harvest, there was a shortage of shirts. It was really that simple.
And that biological bottleneck is exactly what early chemists were desperately trying to bypass. In the late 19th century, so around the 1880s and 90s, we see the first major step, the creation of semi-synthetics.
Like rayon, right?
Exactly, things like rayon. But rayon was essentially a bridge technology. It still relied on nature. They took cellulose from wood pulp, dissolved it using these heavy, really toxic chemicals, and then reformed it into a shiny, silk-like fiber.
The notes call it nature being chemically mutilated.
Yeah, that's a very accurate way to describe it.
But the true break from nature, the moment we severed that agricultural tether entirely, that comes a few decades later. The notes pinpoint 1935 as the absolute watershed moment.
1935, Wallace Carruthers.
Right, a brilliant chemist working at DuPont who invents nylon.
That is the line in the sand. Nylon is the first fully synthetic fiber. With nylon, we were no longer just chemically modifying a piece of wood. We were taking petrochemicals, derivatives of crude oil and natural gas, and building entirely new molecular chains from absolute scratch.
We became molecular architects.
Exactly. We bypassed the farm completely and built a laboratory ecosystem.
And the source material visualizes this transition so beautifully. It uses a world-building analogy from a fictional universe Tommy created called Azima.
I love this part.
Me too. He maps natural fibers to these organic living biomes, like the ancient forests of Cathelgard or the untamed herds of Gunnarsgrim. They are ecosystems that you harvest from.
But synthetic fibers, he maps those to a place called Mannheim.
Right. And Mannheim is all about arcane engineered constructs. It's an environment of pure manipulation where, and I'm quoting the notes here, lava is shaped into threads.
And that lava imagery is scientifically spot on, because to understand how different this is from, say, spinning cotton, you really have to look at the physical process of creating a synthetic fiber.
The extrusion process.
Yeah. These materials are polymers, which are massive macromolecules made of repeating chemical units. To turn them into a thread, you first have to melt those polymer pellets down into a highly viscous, molten liquid.
This is the part that kind of blows my mind. If you've ever seen someone making fresh pasta, or like pulling taffy at a candy shop, it's a similar concept, but happening at this insane, high-tech, microscopic scale.
The Play-Doh fun factory analogy.
Yes, you have this huge vat of molten plastic, and you force it under immense pressure through a metal plate called a spinneret. And this plate is just covered in microscopic holes.
Yeah.
The liquid polymer squirts out of these holes, hits the air, and instantly solidifies into continuous, unbroken filaments.
And a taffy analogy you mentioned earlier is actually perfect for the next step, which is called drawing.
Oh, how so?
Well, when those filaments first solidify, the polymer chains inside them are just a tangled, chaotic mess. If you leave them like that, the thread is weak, it's brittle.
It would just snap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by physically pulling and stretching that filament, literally drawing it out, just like pulling warm taffy, you force all those chaotic molecular chains to align perfectly parallel to each other.
It essentially crystallizes the structure, right?
Yeah, though we should probably avoid relying on that word exactly too much here. The mechanism at play is increased crystalline alignment. By forcing the molecules to line up, the intermolecular forces between them multiply.
Wow.
And that is what gives synthetic fibers their astonishing tensile strength. You are engineering the microscopic geometry of the plastic to resist breaking.
But this raises a huge historical question for me. Did DuPont pour millions of dollars into Carruthers' lab just because they were, I don't know, bored of wool suits? Or was there a specific trigger that forced us into the lab?
It wasn't boredom, that's for sure.
Because the timeline here, 1935, we're sitting right on the precipice of a massive global disaster.
World War II. The trigger was absolute dire necessity. The notes heavily emphasized that the rapid scaling of synthetics was a direct response to the war and the sudden disruption of global supply chains.
Because of silk, right.
Yes. Before the war, the military relied heavily on silk, imported from Asia, particularly Japan. And silk was crucial. It wasn't just for luxury garments. It was the strongest, lightest material available for parachutes, airplane tires, tow ropes.
Things you literally trust your life to.
Exactly. So when geopolitical relations broke down and the silk supply was cut off, the military faced a catastrophic material deficit.
So nylon steps right into the void. I mean, it wasn't just rolled out to make glamorous hosiery for women, even though that's how it famously debuted at the 1939 World's Fair.
No, it was immediately drafted into the war effort. The military essentially commandeered the entire production of nylon. And what they discovered, it completely changed the trajectory of the 20th century.
Because it worked better than silk.
Way better. They realized that this industrial chemistry could not only replace scarce biological materials, but it could actually outperform them. A nylon parachute didn't rot in the jungle humidity the way silk or cotton would.
It didn't care about mold at all.
Right. It was structurally uniform. Every inch of it was identical.
And it proved that you could secure your material supply line as long as you had access to oil and electricity.
Yeah.
You didn't need to worry about a frost wiping out a crop. You just needed to keep the chemical plants running.
That was the true paradigm shift.
Right.
We moved the origin point of human textiles from the fertile soil to the petrochemical refinery. And once that door was open, chemists realized they had unlocked a system with infinite variables.
Right, because if you can build a fiber from scratch for a parachute, you can easily tweak the recipe to build a fiber for a winter coat, or a bathing suit, or a carpet.
You aren't just taking what nature gives you anymore. You are dictating the terms.
Which brings us directly to the titans of this engineered reality. The notes categorize these into what they call the modern Big Six fibers.
The Big Six. They represent the complete colonization of our wardrobes by material science. And, honestly, the sheer tonnage we are talking about is difficult to conceptualize.
Let's start with the undisputed king of the mountain here, polyester. The source notes provide some really staggering data on this.
It's massive.
In the year 2024, polyester alone accounted for 59% of all global fiber output.
Over half of everything.
Yeah. We are talking about 78 million tons of polyester produced in a single year. And the ticker, 88% of it is virgin fossil-based plastic.
88%. It's wild.
It's the ultimate cheap, strong, wrinkle-resistant backbone of the entire fast fashion empire.
And the reason polyester dominates so utterly comes down to two things. Its chemical versatility and its cost. Because it is synthesized from purified terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol.
Say that 5 times fast.
Right. But those are incredibly cheap petrochemical derivatives. It costs literally pennies to produce at scale. Furthermore, it possesses a property called thermoplasticity.
Okay, let's pause here. Explain thermoplasticity for the listener, because it seems like the magic word when it comes to why these clothes look and act the way they do.
Thermoplasticity basically means the fiber responds to heat. If you take a natural fiber, like cotton, and you heat it up, it eventually just scorches and burns.
Right, it turns to ash.
But if you heat up polyester, it softens, and eventually it melts. But in that softened state before it melts, you can manipulate it. You can press a permanent pleat into a skirt, heat set it, and when it cools, that pleat is locked into the molecular memory of the plastic.
You'll literally never wash out.
Never. And you can engineer the fiber to wick moisture away from the skin just by changing the shape of the extrusion hole from a simple circle to, say, a star shape.
Oh, to create like microchannels for sweat.
Exactly. It's endlessly tunable. You can make it do whatever you want.
Okay, so that's polyester, the cheap titan. The second of the big 6 we've already touched on a bit. Nylon, or polyamide, it was the pioneer.
Nylon remains really crucial today because it is generally tougher than polyester. It has a significantly higher abrasion resistance and a smoother texture.
Which is why you see it in things that take a beating. Backpacks, climbing ropes, high-end athletic wear, and of course, hosiery.
Right. However, the chemical process to create nylon is highly energy intensive. And it releases nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So its environmental footprint is actually significantly heavier per ton than polyester.
Interesting. Then we hit the third one, which honestly always feels a bit deceptive to me. Acrylic. The notes highlight that acrylic was specifically engineered to mimic the properties of wool.
It's the great imposter.
It really is. It's lightweight, it holds heat well, and it's incredibly cheap, which is exactly why almost every inexpensive winter sweater or fake fur collar you buy is mostly acrylic. But the notes also point out a terrifying behavioral difference between acrylic and the real wool it's impersonating.
The flammability issue.
Yes.
This is a perfect example of the tension between intended design and chemical reality. Natural wool is inherently flame retardant. Because of the lanolin and the high moisture and nitrogen content in the natural animal hair, wool will just smolder and eventually self-extinguish if you expose it to a flame.
But acrylic,
Acrylic, being a petrochemical polymer, does the exact opposite. It catches fire easily, it burns fiercely, and worst of all, it melts while it burns.
oh wow.
Yeah, it turns into this sticky, burning plastic that literally adheres to human skin.
That is such a brutal trade-off for a cheaper sweater.
Yeah.
I mean, you are essentially wearing solidified gasoline.
From a purely thermal perspective, yes, you kind of are. Moving on to the fourth fiber, we have polypropylene. This is an interesting one because you rarely see it in standard fashion, but it is absolutely everywhere in our daily lives.
Right. The notes describe it as highly hydrophobic, like it absolutely repels water.
Because of that extreme moisture resistance, polypropylene absolutely dominates the disposable textile market. Like if you wear thermal base layers for skiing, it might be polypropylene because it pushes sweat entirely away from your body.
But the real volume isn't in ski gear, is it?
No, it's in non-woven applications. Medical gowns, the surgical face masks we all became very familiar with recently, baby diapers, industrial carpeting. It is cheap, chemically inert, and it flat out refuses to absorb liquid.
Okay, so those 4, polyester, nylon, acrylic, polypropylene, those are basically the everyday workhorses. But the 5th category is where I think synthetics make their most undeniable case for actually existing. Aramids.
The high-performance fibers.
Right. Things like Kevlar and Nomex.
If you ever want to argue the ethical and practical necessity of synthetic fibers, you just point to aramids. You cannot grow a bulletproof vest. You cannot harvest a fireproof suit for a race car driver from a field.
Nature doesn't make that.
No. Aramids are synthesized with these incredibly rigid molecular ring structures. That gives them a strength-to-weight ratio that just borders on science fiction. Kevlar aligns its polymer chains so tightly that a speeding bullet gets caught in the microscopic web, and its kinetic energy is dispersed before it can penetrate.
That's incredible. And Nomex.
Nomex won't melt or ignite, even in a literal flash fire, which is exactly why firefighters rely on it to survive.
It's the ultimate trump card for the petrochemical industry. They can sit there and say, look, we save lives, and they really aren't wrong. The utility there is absolute. But then we arrive at the sixth member of the Big Six. And this is the one that the notes suggest is an absolute curse wrapped in a miracle. Elastane.
Yeah.
We all know it mostly as spandex or lycra.
Elastane fundamentally rewrote the rules of fashion. Completely. It is rarely the primary fiber in a garment. You aren't walking around wearing a 100% elastane shirt.
That would be like wearing a giant rubber band.
Exactly. But if you take a rigid, heavy pair of raw denim jeans and you weave in just 2 to maybe 5% elastane, the physical behavior of that garment transformed completely.
It yields to the body.
Yes, it stretches, and more importantly, it recovers its original shape without bagging out at the knees.
It is the entire foundation of athleisure. Skinny jeans, yoga pants, compression shirts, none of it exists without elastane. But here is where the source material really throws a wrench in the gears. The notes use this incredibly evocative analogy. They call blending fabrics with elastane a goblin with 12 keys and no labeled doors.
It's a great image.
It is, but they are talking about the nightmare of recycling. And I have to push back here, or at least ask for clarity. If my stretchy t-shirt is made of plastic and my water bottle is made of plastic, why can we just melt down the bottle and reuse it, but we can't melt down the shirt?
What's fascinating here is that this is the multi-billion-dollar question in the textile industry right now. It all comes down to the stark difference between mechanical recycling and chemical recycling.
Okay, walk me through it.
Let's look at the water bottle. That is pure PET plastic. Mechanical recycling involves taking that clean, uniform bottle, shredding it into flakes, melting those flakes down, and extruding it back into a fiber. In fact, almost all the recycled polyester clothing you buy today is made from old water bottles, not old clothes.
So it's an open loop. The bottle becomes a fleece jacket.
Correct. But the problem with mechanical recycling is that it's highly destructive. Every single time you melt and chop that polymer, the long molecular chains that give the fiber its strength break down.
They get shorter.
They get shorter and shorter. You can only mechanically recycle that plastic a few times before it degrades into basically useless dust. You cannot mechanically recycle a fleece jacket into a new fleece jacket of the same quality.
Okay, so mechanical recycling degrades the material. What about chemical recycling? The idea where you break the plastic all the way back down into its base chemicals and build it back up perfectly?
Chemical recycling, or depolymerization, sounds like a silver bullet. But it is thermodynamically punishing and incredibly sensitive to contamination.
Yeah.
You're trying to break robust covalent bonds. If you have a shirt that is 100% pure undyed polyester, you might be able to chemically recycle it.
But nobody wears pure undyed polyester.
This is where the goblin comes in. The blends.
The elastane.
Precisely. A standard, comfortable, modern t-shirt is a total nightmare of chemical complexity. It might be 60% cotton, 35% polyester, and 5% elastane, all permanently spun together, dyed with complex heavy metal colorants and coated in a chemical finish to make it feel soft.
So you throw that into a vat.
If you put that blend into a chemical recycling vat, the elastane acts like superglue in the gears. The cotton burns or turns into useless sludge. The dyes contaminate the entire chemical bath. You just cannot easily unbake that cake.
So you have these microscopic threads of totally different materials permanently entangled, and separating them at scale is just economically and chemically unviable right now.
The barriers are immense. The energy required to separate those blends often produces more carbon emissions than just drilling for new oil.
That's depressing.
It is,
Yeah.
which is exactly why the United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP, published a really staggering statistic in 2023. Only 8% of all textile fibers used globally were from recycled sources.
And remember, most of that 8% is just from water bottles.
Right. The percentage of clothing turned back into actual clothing is a fraction of a single percent.
So we are pumping out 78 million tons of virgin polyester every single year, weaving it with elastane so it fits our bodies perfectly, and basically guaranteeing that it will essentially never be recycled.
That's a reality.
The very superpowers that make these fibers invincible in our closets, like their durability, their stretch, their resistance to decay, make them a permanent menace to the planet when we finally toss them in the trash. Which brings us perfectly to the environmental reality detailed in the notes. Tommy refers to synthetics as the rebar of our modern ecosystem.
It is a sobering analogy. In civil engineering, steel rebar is what allows us to build skyscrapers. It provides internal tensile strength, scale, and stability.
Right.
Synthetics do exactly the same thing for the global apparel industry. They are the invisible framework holding fast fashion together. But when a concrete building is demolished, if that steel isn't meticulously extracted and recovered, it just sits in the rubble, rusting into the ground for centuries. It becomes an environmental hazard.
Because it's ecologically mismatched.
Fundamentally mismatched. Biological ecosystems rely entirely on closed loops of breakdown and cycling. A leaf falls, microbes consume it, it becomes soil, it grows a new plant.
But
Synthetics are intentionally designed to resist microbes, resist moisture, and resist degradation. They do not cycle. They persist. We have essentially flooded an environment built on decay with a material engineered for permanence.
And the climate footprint of creating this permanence is just massive.
Mm.
The UNEP estimates that the fashion and textile sector is responsible for between 2 and 8% of all global greenhouse gas emissions.
It's staggering.
It is. That is larger than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. It is a massive carbon footprint tied directly to the extraction of crude oil, the extreme heat of the polymerization reactors, the global shipping of the pellets, and the high-energy spinning processes.
But here is where we have to be incredibly careful and where I think the source material provides excellent nuance. We cannot fall into the trap of assuming that natural automatically means ecologically harmless.
Right, hold on, because I think a lot of people have this really nostalgic view of natural fibers. They think a cotton shirt is just like a gentle gift from the earth. But farming millions of tons of cotton is brutally hard on the planet too, isn't it?
It is devastating. Conventional cotton agriculture is intensely reliant on pesticides, herbicides, and vast amounts of synthetic fertilizers, which cause massive nitrogen runoff and oceanic dead zones.
And water. It uses so much water.
Cotton is incredibly thirsty. The historical diversion of rivers to irrigate cotton fields in Central Asia literally caused the Aral Sea to dry up.
Wow.
Yeah, it was one of the worst ecological disasters of the 20th century.
And wool isn't innocent either.
Not at the scale we consume it, no. Millions of sheep require massive land use, which drives deforestation. And they are ruminants, meaning they release enormous quantities of methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. Even viscose, which is the modern descendant of rayon, drives the logging of ancient and endangered forests just to harvest the wood pulp.
So the notes are arguing that the framing of synthetic equals evil, natural equals good, is intellectually lazy. As the text puts it, that's the whole loom, not just one thread.
Exactly. The real evaluation has to look at the entire life cycle. What fiber is it? Where was it grown or synthesized? What energy grid powered the factory? How long is it going to be used? And what actually happens when it's thrown away?
A life cycle assessment is really the only valid metric. However, having said all that, there is one specific, terrifying environmental horror that is entirely unique to synthetics.
In microplastics.
Yes, the crisis of microplastics. Let's dive into this because the numbers here are deeply unsettling. The notes cite data from the European Environment Agency estimating that in the year 2019 alone, between 1.6 to 61.1 kilotons of textile microplastics were unintentionally released into the EU environment.
Kilotons.
Textiles is the fourth largest source of microplastics globally, trailing only behind vehicle tires, city dust, and raw plastic pellets.
And to really understand why this happens, we have to revisit the concept of permanence versus degradation. Because a polyester polymer chain cannot easily biodegrade, meaning microbes cannot just eat it and turn it into carbon dioxide and water.
Yeah.
The material deals with physical stress through fragmentation.
It doesn't break down, it just breaks apart.
Exactly. It just snaps into smaller and smaller microscopic plastic threads.
Wait, I always thought the microplastic problem was strictly a laundry issue. The narrative has always been, you put your synthetic fleece in the washing machine, the agitator beats the fabric up, microscopic fibers break off, and they wash down the drain into the ocean. Which is bad enough.
Oh, it's terrible.
But the notes imply it is vastly more pervasive than just laundry water. Are you telling me my stretchy jacket is shedding plastic just by me walking down the street?
Without question. The shedding is constant, and it happens across the entire life cycle of the garment. It starts in the manufacturing facility, where cutting and sewing generate invisible plastic dust. But even as you wear a garment, the simple physical friction of your arms swimming against your sides or taking a backpack on and off causes microscopic fibers to snap and shed into the ambient air.
So I am literally leaving a trail of invisible plastic lint everywhere I walk.
We all are. And then consider the tumble dryer. If the washing machine is a gentle bath that removes fibers, the tumble dryer is essentially a hot air cannon.
Oh, man.
You are applying heat, which slightly softens those thermoplastic polymers we talked about, and then you are violently tumbling them together. The lint you clean out of the dryer trap, that is a concentrated brick of microplastics.
But not all of it stays in the trap.
Not even close. Millions of tiny fibers pass right through that filter and are blasted out of the exhaust vent directly into the atmosphere into your neighborhood.
That is horrifying. The notes even talk about how these textiles weather in landfills. When we throw away a polyester dress and it sits under the baking sun in a dump, the UV radiation makes the plastic brittle, and then the wind just scours the microplastics off the surface and carries them away.
They are finding textile microfibers in the snow at the summit of Mount Everest and in the deepest trenches of the Mariana Trench.
It's everywhere.
But perhaps the most concerning vector is actually inhalation. There is a recognized phenomenon of indoor textile dust. Because our carpets, our curtains, our couches, and our clothes are all mostly synthetic, the dust floating in the sunlight in your living room is heavily composed of microscopic plastic filaments.
Wait, seriously?
We are inhaling the pulverized fragments of our own furnishings in fast fashion.
We are breathing in the consequences of our closets.
Yeah.
It really paints a picture of an industrial system that has completely escaped human control, which naturally begs the question, if the environmental toll is this severe, if the microplastics are literally in our lungs and our oceans, and if the recycling system is essentially broken, why on earth do we keep making 78 million tons of this stuff every single year?
To answer that, we have to pivot from chemistry to global economics. We have to look at how synthetic fibers completely rewire the architecture of power, human labor, and the very definition of scarcity.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because it explains the why behind all this madness. The notes outline this massive historical shift in geopolitical power structures.
Right.
Before the invention of synthetics, if you wanted to be a titan of the textile industry, you needed to control land. You needed thousands of acres of fertile soil for cotton in the American South or India. Or you needed vast rolling hills in Australia to graze massive herds of sheep. Wealth was intrinsically tied to agricultural geography, but synthetics inverted that entirely.
They completely severed the connection to the soil. Synthetics shifted the locus of power from land control to infrastructure and system control. Suddenly, the ability to produce 1 million shirts wasn't threatened by a drought or a blight of boll weevils or a harsh winter.
It was just math.
Exactly. Production was limited only by the output of oil derricks, the refining capacity of cracking plants, and the availability of cheap electricity. The people who became truly rich weren't plantation owners. They were multinational petrochemical conglomerates and the global logistics corporations that move the resin around the world.
You swap the farmer for the chemical engineer.
Yeah.
And it fundamentally changed who was actually doing the physical work of making our clothes, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We moved from a somewhat localized, visible craft system to this highly fragmented, invisible global machine.
The sheer scale of the fragmentation is difficult to even grasp. Let's trace the journey of a single, cheap polyester running shirt. The raw material might begin as crude oil extracted in the Middle East. That oil is shipped to a massive, highly automated chemical refinery, perhaps in China or Taiwan, where it is cracked and synthesized into pure PET polymer pellets.
And notice that up to this point, very little human labor is actually involved. It is mostly pipes, heat, and pressure managed by technicians.
It's heavily capital-intensive, not labor-intensive.
Right.
Those pellets are then moved to an industrial spinning facility where they are melted and extruded into threads, still mostly automated. But then those spools of thread and vast rolls of woven fabric are shipped to garment factories in the global south, places like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, or India. And here, the automation completely stops.
Because sewing a garment is still incredibly difficult for a robot to do. Fabric is floppy, it's unpredictable, you still need human hands.
You need millions of human hands. The notes point out that this assembly phase is predominantly done by women, often working 10 to 14-hour shifts, routinely in unsafe conditions, for wages that barely scrape the very edge of subsistence. The dark paradox of the synthetic revolution is that we used cutting-edge, automated chemical engineering to create the raw material, but we still completely rely on archaic, grueling human sweatshop labor to stitch it together.
There's this massive intentional disconnect. In traditional craft, the labor was visible. A century ago, you likely knew the person who tailored your coat, or at least you knew they lived in your town. Now, this system is so vast, so intentionally opaque, that the wearer in New York and the maker in Dhaka are separated by oceans, middlemen, and layers of corporate abstraction.
The brand selling the shirt often doesn't even own the factory that makes it.
Exactly. The accountability just evaporates into the supply chain.
It creates a structural race to the bottom. Because the raw material, the polyester, is so incredibly cheap and ubiquitous, brands cannot compete on the cost of the fabric anymore. So to maximize their profit margins, they have to relentlessly squeeze the cost of labor.
Which means moving.
They constantly shift production to whatever country has the weakest labor laws, the lowest minimum wage, and the most lax environmental regulations. The cheapness of the synthetic fiber actually accelerates the exploitation of the human worker.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I want to push back on the idea that this is purely an engine for evil. The source text explicitly mentions that synthetics democratized clothing. Didn't cheap polyester essentially clothe the modern world? Haven't these factories, despite their massive flaws, created millions of jobs globally that, for many of these workers, are still vastly preferable to the sheer precarity and poverty of subsistence farming?
That is the sharpest ethical tension in the entire document. And we have to impartially examine both sides of that coin. It is an undeniable fact that cheap synthetics made warm, durable, functional clothing accessible across all global income levels.
It wasn't always like that.
Not at all. A century ago, a high-quality winter coat was an investment that could cost a month's salary. Today, a family with limited income can buy a synthetic puffer jacket that will keep their child perfectly warm in a blizzard for the cost of a few meals. That is a massive, tangible social benefit.
Right. It basically eliminated the scarcity of basic human protection against the elements.
Furthermore, for developing nations, the textile industry has historically been the very first rung on the ladder of industrialization. It does pull people out of agrarian poverty and introduces them to wage labor, which can eventually lead to broader economic development.
So where does it go wrong? When does it tip from democratization to destruction?
It tips over when the cheapness of the material enables massive systemic overproduction. The global fashion system no longer produces clothing merely to meet human needs. It produces an immense calculated surplus designed entirely for rapid obsolescence.
We're talking billions of items.
We are churning out over 100 billion garments a year. So while it created access, it normalized a system where extreme corporate wealth is generated by paying wages that don't reflect a living standard and creating mountains of waste that are routinely boxed up and exported right back to the global south to rot in their landfills or choke their rivers.
The geographic segregation of cause and effect. The global north gets the cheap clothes and the corporate profits. The global south gets the sweatshop labor and the toxic waste. We solved the ancient problem of scarcity, but we just replaced it with a modern nightmare of unchecked, disposable abundance.
Yes, that is the exact trade-off.
And what fascinates me is how this hyperabundance didn't just change the economy or the environment. According to Tommy's notes, it fundamentally rewired human culture, our aesthetics, and what the very concept of clothing means to us. Let's dive into the pop culture evolution of synthetics, because the timeline is a wild ride.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the cultural perception of synthetic fibers over the last 90 years is a perfect mirror for society's shifting relationship with technology, convenience, and consumption. The exact same molecules have meant vastly different things to different generations.
Let's wind the clock back to the 1930s and 40s. When DuPont first rolled out nylon stockings, they were not viewed as cheap plastic garbage. They were an absolute marvel.
Pure science fiction.
The marketing slogans called them finer than spider silk and stronger than steel. They represented scientific optimism. Wearing nylon meant you were sophisticated, you were stepping into a clean, engineered future.
It was the aesthetic of modernity. But as we moved into the post-war boom of the 1950s and 60s, the symbolism shifted, the technology scaled up, and the marketing pivoted entirely toward domestic liberation. Synthetics like polyester and acrylic were branded as easy care fabrics. They were wash and wear, wrinkle-free, and shrink-proof.
They were marketed directly at the suburban housewife.
Exactly. They represented a literal liberation from the drudgery of domestic labor. You didn't have to spend hours starching and ironing cotton shirts or carefully darning holes in wool socks. Synthetics were the practical, indestructible uniform of the modern, efficient household. They were a technological promise of more free time.
And then the 1970s crashed the party, and synthetics just go entirely unapologetic. We entered the disco era. We're talking leisure suits, double-knit polyester, wild neon colors, shining metallic plastic-like textures.
The fashion wasn't trying to mimic nature anymore.
Not at all. It was actively flaunting its artificiality. It was space age, it was psychedelic, it was loud.
But that cultural peak was followed by a very steep valley. As we moved into the 1980s and 90s, the sheer volume of polyester production drove the price into the ground, and a psychological shift occurred. As polyester flooded the discount bins, it lost its futuristic cachet entirely.
It became heavily stigmatized.
Yes, it was suddenly associated with sweatiness, cheapness, disposability, and low socioeconomic status. If you wore polyester in the 90s, it meant you couldn't afford cotton.
But at the exact same time, a divergent trend was happening. While everyday polyester was becoming a punchline, high-performance synthetics were creating a new religion: sportswear.
Yes, the technological split. Companies began engineering synthetics not for cheapness, but for elite athletic performance. Tracksuits, windbreakers, Gore-Tex rain shells, moisture-wicking compression gear. In this context, synthetics symbolized health, extreme mobility, and professional dedication.
Which brings us directly to the modern day, where these two streams, cheap disposability and high performance, have violently collided to create the current aesthetic reality. If we look at the bigger picture of fashion design, the notes point out that synthetics changed the entire industry from being material-constrained to being concept-driven. What does that actually mean for the clothes on the rack?
It represents a total inversion of the design process. Historically, a designer had to ask, what is this piece of wool physically capable of doing? The inherent limits of the natural material dictated the final form of the garment.
You could only stretch wool so far.
Right. But because of the tunable superpowers of synthetic polymers, a modern designer works backward. They start by asking, what behavior do we want to engineer into this fabric?
The idea comes first. The chemistry follow.
Precisely. Do we want a jacket that weighs 3 ounces but stops gale force winds? Do we want leggings that stretch 4 ways but aggressively compress the muscles? Form is completely unchained from the limitations of nature. We can engineer the fabric to do whatever our imagination demands.
And nowhere is this more aggressively obvious than the athleisure movement. We took high-performance, engineered athletic wear and turned it into everyday casual identity wear. People are wearing moisture-wicking compression leggings to go buy groceries.
Or just sit on the couch.
Exactly. They're wearing specialized, water-resistant hiking pants to sit at a desk in an air-conditioned office. The aesthetic signals efficiency, fitness, and constant motion, even when we are totally sedentary.
But the notes highlight a fascinating paradox in modern aesthetics. There's a large segment of the population that actively rejects the synthetic aesthetic. They want the natural look. They buy the rough, organic linen shirts, the heavy heritage denim, the thick woolen sweaters, specifically to signal their environmental awareness and authenticity.
But the trap is that even they can't escape it.
They cannot, because synthetics have become the invisible structural foundation of all modern apparel. Even if your shirt is 100% organic cotton, the thread holding the seams together is almost certainly polyester, because cotton thread snaps in modern high-speed sewing machines.
The hidden linings in your leather shoes.
The tiny percentage of elastane in your heritage denim, the water-resistant coating on your canvas trench coat synthetics are entirely ubiquitous. Unless you are weaving your own clothes on a wooden loom, you are reliant on petrochemical infrastructure.
This connects deeply to a psychological observation in Tommy's notes, specifically what he calls the snowflake reflection. It's this behavioral loop of wake up, create, scrap, repeat. It really struck me because clothing used to be an anchor for personal identity.
Yes, a very permanent anchor.
A century ago, you owned maybe a few outfits. They were expensive, they were tailored, they were repaired, and they defined your social standing for years. But because synthetics have made clothing virtually free and infinitely abundant, it feels like our wardrobes have mutated into physical versions of our social media feeds.
The parallel is really striking.
It's all about infinite variation and total disposability. We buy a neon mesh top for a concert, wear it once, take a photo, and throw it away. We're just trying on micro-identities for weekends and discarding them.
And that exposes the deepest cultural tragedy outlined in the text. The physical object, the polyester shirt, is chemically engineered to last for centuries without breaking down. But its cultural meaning is designed by the fashion industry to expire in 3 weeks.
That's a crazy contrast.
We use an indestructible material to manufacture an ephemeral product. As the notes brilliantly summarize it, the system delivers immense quantity while we still desperately search for significance. We have democratized the acquisition of clothing, but we've completely hollowed out the meaning of clothing itself.
Delivers quantity while we search for significance.
That is a heavy, profound realization, and it perfectly sets the stage for the final section of Tommy's notes, the philosophical lens. Because this isn't just about shirts, it's about what it actually means when a species decides to stop accepting the limits of the natural world and starts rewriting the rules of physical reality. Philosophically, synthetic fibers are the ultimate physical manifestation of human agency over material reality. The core operating principle of humanity shifted from a posture of receiving what the environment provides to a posture of dictation. If nature doesn't provide it, we will synthesize it.
Coal mastery.
It is the absolute expression of control. But as the text argues, every assertion of control introduces the immutable tension of consequence.
Right. It's the classic hubris of engineering. The more control we exert in designing the absolutely perfect, wrinkle-free, hyper-stretchy, waterproof fabric, the more we inherit a cascade of consequences we completely failed to plan for, like microplastics infiltrating our bloodstream and mountains of toxic waste choking the coastlines of developing nations. The notes make an incredible observation here. Humans don't just adapt to systems, we scale them until they become invisible and therefore completely unaccountable.
When an industrial system becomes as vast, complex, and globally distributed as the petrochemical textile supply chain, no single person can comprehend the whole picture, and no single corporation or government feels accountable for its fallout. The consequences are socialized globally, while the profits are privatized locally. And the text is very clear that we cannot innovate our way out of this purely with more chemistry. The solution isn't just inventing a better polyester.
Yeah, the notes do look at the horizon of future technological solutions, and they are fascinating. They talk about bio-based PET, which is making polyester from agricultural waste like corn stalks instead of crude oil.
Which still requires immense energy.
Right. They mention enzyme-assisted recycling, which sounds like total science fiction engineering specific bacteria to literally eat the polyester and excrete the base chemicals so we can rebuild it without contamination. And they talk about policy shifts, like digital product passports, which are QR codes woven into the fabric that tell a recycling plant exactly what chemical goblin of a blend is inside the garment.
And extended producer responsibility systems, where the brand that makes the cheap shirt is legally and financially responsible for recycling it when the consumer throws it away.
But the notes are incredibly blunt. All of these innovations, the enzymes, the bioplastics, the QR codes, they are entirely useless if the sheer staggering volume of production keeps expanding. The deepest solution isn't better plastic. It is a better system. It means producing vastly fewer disposable garments, wearing them longer, enforcing safer chemistry, and demanding genuine, closed-loop, end-of-life pathways.
To help navigate this transition on an individual level, Tommy's notes provide a highly practical 6-question evaluation framework. It is essentially a tool for personal auditing, designed to help us interact with this massive petrochemical system more thoughtfully.
I found this part incredibly empowering because it cuts through the overwhelm. Let's walk through the questions. Number 1, is the synthetic functionally necessary? Number 2, is it durable? Number 3, is it blended? Number 4, will it shed heavily? Number 5, can it be repaired? And number 6, which the notes call the trapdoor under the whole castle. Does this product reduce total consumption, or does it just enable more of it?
It's a really rigorous filter.
It is. So how do you, our listener, actually apply this framework tomorrow morning when you are getting dressed or when you were standing in a store holding a jacket? Because the mature position here clearly isn't just screaming ban all synthetics and trying to weave your own clothes from hemp, but it also even blindly trusting that a magical recycling enzyme will fix this in 10 years. What is the practical application?
This raises an important question, and the framework asks you to sort these fibers by their intended purpose. You apply it by looking ruthlessly at the utility of the item you are holding. Are you buying a specialized waterproof hardshell jacket for alpine climbing?
Or like medical scrubs?
Yes, medical scrubs that need to withstand chemical sterilization. Or high-visibility protective gear for a construction site. In those specific cases, the synthetic fiber is functionally necessary. It is providing life-saving or essential, highly durable performance. That is a valid, respectful use of complex engineered chemistry.
But what if I'm holding a neon green, tissue-thin polyester party shirt that I know I'm only going to wear to one single festival and then toss in the back of my closet?
In that scenario, the synthetic fiber isn't providing essential technical performance, it is merely enabling cheap disposability. The framework encourages you to aggressively avoid synthetics in everyday, trend-driven fashion. It asks you to check the tag and see if the garment is a complex, chaotic blend of polyester, cotton, and spandex, knowing that it will be a total nightmare to recycle.
Or cheap fleece?
Right. It asks you to avoid cheap, loosely knit brushed fleece that you know will shed massive amounts of microplastics the second it hits the washing machine.
It's basically asking us to stop treating indestructible petrochemicals as if they were disposable paper napkins.
It demands that we respect the material. Treat the chemistry with the gravity it actually deserves. Use synthetics where their unique superpowers genuinely matter, and reject them where they merely facilitate thoughtless overconsumption.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. To synthesize all of this, synthetic fibers are undeniably brilliant. They solved the historical bottleneck of biological scarcity, they democratized access to warm and durable clothing for billions of people, and they provide life-saving technical performance in extreme environments.
True marvels of science.
They really are. But they are incredibly heavy with consequence. They are, as the notes beautifully summarize, fossil chemistry woven directly into daily life. We engineered our way out of nature's constraints, but in doing so, we introduced a terrifying permanence to our waste, and we entangled our own closets with global petrochemical extraction and complex, invisible labor exploitation.
It is the ultimate story of human progress viewed in a microcosm. We solved an immediate problem through sheer, audacious ingenuity, but because we refused to consider the limits of scale, we created a vastly larger systemic crisis in its wake.
It truly is. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on everything we've just discussed about the absolute permanence of these materials. We know that the cheap polyester shirts, the stretchy fast fashion jeans, and the discarded fleeces sitting in our landfills right now are literally made of concentrated fossil fuels. And we know they will take centuries to break down.
Centuries.
So is it possible that future generations will look at our garbage dumps not as tragic waste sites, but as the new oil fields? Centuries from now, will the natural resources our descendants have to mine to survive simply be the fast fashion synthetic wardrobes that we blindly threw away today?
That is a staggering perspective on the legacy we are physically leaving in the soil.
So tomorrow morning, when you open your closet and pull out a shirt, take one extra second. Look at the tag, look past the brand name, look past the logo, and try to truly see the invisible, engineered global ecosystem that is resting right there against your skin. Because what was once a simple wooden chair with a clear, honest origin is now a murky, fascinating, and deeply consequential web. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.